Good morning. Good morning and welcome to Friday Plenary. And this morning we are going to hear from 3 of our state leaders who have been working to move their organizations towards racial justice. And we are very, very lucky to be welcoming Kendra Johnson from Equality North Carolina here. Adrian Carver from Equality New Mexico. And Monica Meyer for Out Front, Minnesota. And so this, oh, right, I forgot to pop the music. Thank you so much, Val, for doing that. This is why we have little spreadsheets with tasks. Perfect. This really will be a conversation about the efforts and work that these 3 executive directors have been doing in their organizations, with the hope that we can hear a little inspiration, hear a little how-tos, and the mix of really all the work that across big, medium, and small organizations have been able to do and are planning to do in this issue of how to integrate racial justice into the LGBTQ work and movement that we're all doing here. So the first question that I have for you all really is, what sparked it for you to want to move your organizations towards racial justice? Maybe your organization was already in the process and you joined it, or maybe you were the start of that for your organization. But what was it for you that sparked your interest?
Good morning. For me, our organization, I was lucky. Our organization had started the process before I was even hired. Because there was a period without an executive director, they decided to do a really intentional process whereby they listened to stakeholders in North Carolina, both aspirational partners and long-term partners, in order to find out what the key stakeholders in the state that have been doing the work for years wanted to see in the next executive director. And what they found is actually the allies and supporters, and some of them not supporters, were very frank in their comments to the organization about where the organization had been working, how it had been doing its work, and they wanted to see a change. So very luckily, when I was in the recruitment process, they showed me that scan, and the comments were very clear that they needed leadership that would represent all of North Carolina, and they felt like the organization had not been doing that. Specifically, they wanted to see more trans and Black and brown folks in leadership within the organization. And when I joined the process, that was actually one of the things that sold me on the organization, was being able to do the work of continuing to introduce a racial equity lens. And so they had been doing some of the work of diversifying the board already and trying to figure out what this journey would look like.
Good morning. From New Mexico, this very much the same way. The organization made this pivot and this move before I came to the organization, and it's part of what attracted me to the work, because the racial justice work is at the very center of everything that we do, and it's fundamental to the movement. And what happened after marriage is this, and I always get very academic about it. It's like, this work is tied to the issue of race and equity, and it has to be, and it always will be, and it should have been from the very beginning. And as a younger leader in the movement, I have been able to come into the movement in a way where we get to do the work post-marriage, that this is a critique of that I wish we would have been able to do from the beginning. And so that's what attracted me to being able to do this work is that it feels like we're in this moment where racial justice is at the center of what we should be doing. Anti-white supremacy is at the center of all of our work, and I think that's important, and I wish that would have been part of the movement from the very beginning.
Hi everyone, good morning. So I'm from Outfront, Minnesota, and Outfront's been around since 1987. And I would say that probably from, the start, I think there were a lot of intentions around, I don't even know how they talked about it when Outfront started, but I think a couple bigger moments that I think helped us move, I think, more along the lines of working for racial equity and then also combating white supremacy was one of those was when we were working on our constitutional amendment to ban marriage. That was in 2011, it passed through our legislature, it was on the ballot in 2012. And before our legislature was done, there were about 4 or 5 other kinds of ballot initiatives they were looking for, the Republicans in our legislature. And one of those was, there were a bunch of anti-tax, there were some anti-choice amendments, and then the one that actually also passed was one that would have restricted voter rights. And so voter restriction and constitutional amendment. And what was so difficult, I think, for our state was we had our marriage amendment that we were working on since 2011. The voter restriction amendment passed pretty late in our legislative session in 2012. All the polls showed that it was going to pass, that there was nothing you could do, that Minnesota was just going to go from being the state that usually has the highest voter turnout to probably significantly taking a whack at voting rights. And what happened between the 2 amendments was that people got real turfy. They got, our 2 amendments at first, it looked like there could have been a big kind of oppositional kind of relationship. For Outfront, we took a stance against all of them that came forward and pushed hard for our organization to work out both. And what that meant was, it meant that we actually got to invest more in organizing, more and deeper organizing in the communities we wanted to be in. But the arguments that we would have around, for instance, during the marriage, at the marriage table to fight the amendment were that, when people would say, well, what do you think about that voting thing? And some of the people around on our board for the marriage amendment would say, some of our board actually supports that passing about actually, restricting voters. It was voter ID amendment, and so we had to really, stop that. And people saying that it was definitely not a do no harm for a while. The good story is that we were able to defeat both of those amendments, which was really great. But I think that was one of the ways where we started, I think, looking at what Outfront was doing. We also were in a strategic planning process at that time and hearing, I think, some of the similar things that, that Kendra was talking about we weren't doing the racial justice work that we said we wanted to do, and it just looked pretty hollow. So we started looking at what that would be like to actually, put that into action and just show up places.
And so in that, I'm hearing that we've got 2 leaders up here who the organization had already made a commitment in moving towards racial justice, and then another leader up here who it was part of your process of seeing something come up in your state and really wrestling with that, and that was part of the move in that. Adrian, do you want to add something?
Yeah, we often talk about this conversation in a way that is, there's a place that we need to go to, like there's a thing that we need to do. But that's not what it is. We're talking about a stance. We're talking about fundamentally thinking about how we do the work. There's not a destination that we're going to, and we often allow ourselves to. We are pushed by many influencers in the movement, funders, etc. to make this a destination, and it's not. This is a stance. This isn't a place we're going. It's a thing we should be in.
Thanks. And one of the things, Adrian, that you and I had talked about previously when we were setting this panel up was that the personal identities that we carry. And I'm wondering, Adrian, if you would want to chat about how your personal racial identity has impacted the way that you're bringing your organization along.
Yeah, it's really complicated, and it's, you know, I'm a generation New Mexican. I am Latino, and at the same time, I'm white presenting, and so white supremacy shows up in our work in many ways because of the way that I present. And that's important to own and to talk about and to think about the perfection that we have to present in this work, and specifically for an executive director, you know, to be able to, not to be able, but to have to also, present this very polished view of the work that we do in the way that we fundraise and work with funders. It's really complicated, and in New Mexico, we get to, and very intentionally for generations, have been having conversations about colonialism and about how we just have been in the place that we are in New Mexico, and so it's one of those things that you kind of wake up every day, and that I wake up every day, and I think about, because I know what I look like, and I know what the power that has in some of the spaces that I have to pass into, and so it's at the same time we have to always think about that and make sure that we're doing the work in a way that honors that history, but also that we can interrupt some of those systems.
And so in that, I hear, again, there's not a place to arrive at, but that who am I and how is that interacting in the world and fitting in that. Either of you have anything that you'd like to jump in on that? Yeah, great. So I'm wondering, Kendra, if you might be able to talk about some of the challenges that you have had to, that you've experienced.
I think one of the biggest challenges that any person faces in starting this process is actually challenging the white supremacy that we all sort of carry inside of ourselves, even as people of color, and deconstructing that. Starting the process of deconstructing that is complicated. And I think when I started, I've only been on the job for about a year and 2 months, I knew that we needed to start from inside the organization before we jumped on doing the work externally, to make sure that we wouldn't have any missteps externally. And so we embarked on a racial sensitivity training for the staff, and within the first 30 minutes of our racial sensitivity training, someone dropped the N-word twice in conversations with me in a peer share. And it was clear that we had a lot of work to do after that. And it created a great dialogue amongst the staff, and it made me clear sort of that we were going to need to be on a longer journey with training for all the staff, all the board, all the volunteers as we started this process. And we were going to have to bring also our constituency along. So we started out, and then when we had a person who had the right voice for our communications to just start talking about broader issues. And we've had plenty of issues from our constituency, racist, sexist, transphobic comments come up with everything that we've talked about as we tried to bring in broader issues that reflect the full fabric of the LGBTQ community. anti-immigrant, xenophobia. It's just been extremely challenging, and figuring out how to walk the balance of having these comments sort of pop up in spaces, so people can also see the racism, the sexism, the homophobia, the white supremacy that is coming from our base, and then at what point do you shut it down so it's not toxic? And we're still figuring that out as an organization, but it's been good for us as a staff to be engaged in these conversations. Similarly, beyond the staff, deconstructing white supremacy inside of the board is a complicated task as well. People don't like to think of themselves as racist, and racism is woven into the fabric of this very society, and so we're constantly, I never thought I would have to interrupt a board member who was talking over me when I'm presenting. I never thought that I would have to say really condescending things to my board. Luckily, I'm not conflict avoidant, but there have been times when people white supremacy has shown up with grace for people who have clearly done things to harm the organization. And so it's just been sort of battle after battle from staff to board to constituency. But we're committed to that fight. And the staff that we have now, I think, is committed also to grow in this process, which makes all the difference.
Adrian, how about you? What are some challenges that you have found?
Again, my presentation is a big part of that challenge. But I think that it's especially, it's different with this very, very small organization. Equality in New Mexico, we are, for folks that don't know, our staff kind of ebbs and flows quite a bit. Right now, I am the only full-time staff person, and so that, lived experience of, just waking up and thinking about, what I was saying earlier every day is, that's the challenge, right? And then interacting with these larger systems, the funding and other partners that are doing this work is one of the biggest challenges.
Monica, do you have anything that you'd like to add for that one? Great. So really hearing about the different locations of challenges is something that I heard from the two of you all. So looking at funders, board, staff, constituents, and the necessity that you found to really be unique for those different areas and think about how white supremacy will show up and how you can interrupt that in different ways in those different spaces. So Monica, I'm wondering, what are some of the things that you all have done as an organization to move towards racial justice?
I guess I'll just say a quick thing about challenges. So as we talk about some of the things, as we were really trying to be more intentional about working on racial equity, of course, the white supremacy, and then I think, with me being white and still also, working on how I'm dealing with my own white supremacy, white privilege, and then also trying to help a lot of our board. At the time, particularly when we started, was really a good challenge in that we did a couple bold things that I think we were able to share what we were hearing back from the community about that helped them learn how much racism there still is in the LGBTQ communities. And so one of those things we did was in November of 2015, Jamar Clark was shot and killed by police. He's a young black man. And it was, just shook our state and particularly our city. And I think immediately there were very young LGBTQ people of color who took over the 4th precinct where Jamar was shot. And And we were slow, but we were able eventually to I think it wasn't too bad. It was like within a week, we were able to put out a statement and get other LGBTQ groups to sign on to a Black Lives Matter statement and sign on in support of the occupation of the 4th Precinct. And then as an Outfront staff and board, I called the board and I just said, staff get to use their staff time to go support what's happening there for white people on staff, to go and actually be marshals and put their bodies in the way of police, and also bring food and drinks and lots of milk because there was tear gas, and then I shared what we were hearing back from people in the community who were saying horrendous things about how dare we, take a stand and support, people who are, doing illegal activities, and I think for us that was a really good. I think that was a good place for our organization to really learn what people were saying, the white people, right? To wake up a little bit more and be like, oh, okay, this is really happening. This is actually what people in our community are facing all the time. And then for us, I think we just kept looking at the ways that our organization again had like lots of good intentions and really sweet, welcoming thoughts, but we weren't acting. So one of the things that we did was we changed our questionnaire and the way we do our endorsement process. And we started by asking all the candidates that we were screening and talking to and filling out questionnaires about how they were going to address, work to advance racial equity and actually, really look at the fact that Minnesota has some of the worst racial disparities in the country, but like, what are they going to do about it? And then our second question was about expanding democracy, and our third was about specific economic justice issues like, $15 minimum wage, earn sick and save time, wage theft, those kind of issues. And I think it was surprising for a lot of the candidates. And then we had a conversation about like, how do we stop what's going on in our state, which is a lot of Democrats who are not being bold, who have been in office but aren't even thinking about the racial disparities in our state or what they could do. And so our first endorsement, I think that really, showed that we were changing was that we had a race in our Minnesota House of Representatives where there was a longtime Democratic supporter and right by one of our college campuses, big, every Democrat wins. Her name is Phyllis Khan, and then we had Ilhan Omar running. And Ilhan, at the time, so now U.S. Representative, Ilhan Omar, yeah. I know, right? Maybe we should send her a picture at some point. Yeah, she's having a rough time right now. So we endorsed Ilhan, and we were the first group to do it in our state. And we also, I think, really started pushing on the Democratic Party and saying, you're not doing enough, you don't even care about expanding democracy, you're not supporting people who are actually going to move our state into a different place. And I think for us, that was a good path to start down, because then we've been able to continue not just having Democrats take us for granted, and also to be much more clear about how we are getting people engaged and what we're engaging around.
Great. And really, in that I hear these very big systems that you all have worked in to push, and really thinking about how you can leverage your position with these big systems to have some different action happen. And Kendra, you talked about this a little bit, but I'm wondering if there's anything else that you'd like to expand on the work that you all have been doing organizationally.
Yeah, so we have looked at also in our endorsement process what kind of questions. There's still room for us to develop that, and we'll be retooling a little bit before 2020. But what questions we're asking our candidates around that. We are about to resume our strategic planning process, and so I was very intentional about finding a trainer that not only was an organizational development piece, but also had a long history of doing racial equity work and leading those processes. So there are two that are coming One that is actually a fabulous author, Tim Alcoon, is going to be doing some of the work with us in short lab. It was very intentionally to have a person, two people, one black, one white, so that we would have a diversity of perspective as they led us through this process. One person with a black liberation frame and another person who is pretty much across the board, but also has a strong frame around Palestinian liberation. So we're talking about things that are much broader than just the U.S. context. We're looking at the training that we're going to have for the staff and how we will interweave that also for volunteers going forward, as well as the board. And we've already started with the board to introduce at every board meeting and some of our check-ins racial equity questions as icebreakers, so that we're having this conversation as a board so people can start to see themselves and how class privilege shows up, how race privilege shows up, and some of their concepts around gender identity and other things. And so that's part of this sort of intentional journey. And then, as I said before, one of the first things that we started doing was just actually talking about LGBTQ issues from a broader lens than we see from some of the traditional sort of mainstream LGBTQ organizations, as well as within some of our programming. All of our programming will be focused on issues that will go beyond the traditional issues. So we're looking to have a broader lens when we're working with our legislators to talk about how, for example, if they're going to introduce education policy, how that will affect the LGBTQ community, but particularly black and brown, resource poor, immigrant communities as well. So we're moving toward those things. We're not there yet. We're starting the journey, but the focus really is figuring out how these things are always front and center in every piece of work that we do.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? So when you all do your check-ins, and you said that you have a question about racial equity, can you think of what an example might be? And the tangibility of it can be helpful. Like, what's an example of a question that you have asked in a staff meeting or a check-in?
So this is for the board in particular. Yeah, so the staff, we haven't introduced this as much because we're all on this journey together. But for the board, the most recent one that we did, I think was, can you tell us about your race and your class and how that has shown up as both a privilege or it's served to your detriment? And then it was basically an exercise where the person spoke for 5 minutes without being interrupted. And then there was the other person spoke. And then there was a reflection afterward in the group rather than, and so people had never had the opportunity to actually just talk about race or class for 5 minutes without someone pushing back or questioning. It was a silent exercise of you just talking about your reality. And then we had reflections back in the group. And it was powerful for a lot of people because they realized they had never thought about their race or class, whereas some of the folks on the board, it was all that they had thought or experienced, their whole life in every space that they were navigating.
And then one more question about that, the work with the legislators, and talking about how you all are asking when you're pushing policy and making those relationships, asking about how it affects the LGBTQ community and black and brown folks. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you all are doing to assist keeping that front and center. Like, is there anything that you're writing down or memos or kind of anything like that, or is it a way that you're doing it rather than some sort of formal policy?
So we're just at the beginning of this, and we're rebuilding relationships with legislators after HB2, and HB 142. So part of it is positioning ourselves as a resource instead of saying, hey, we have this bill we want you to run. But it's like, consider us a resource, come to us. The slate is bigger than marriage equality and bathrooms, although those are big issues and they're important. Let's talk about all these other issues and how they impact the community. And when you're passing a bill, you may think that it might be a great bill that you're introducing, but it might inadvertently have an impact on a community that you're not pondering. So consider engaging us to ask about the language. So it's just, right now, we're just positioning. We haven't put forth anything other than aims prepared our policy slate for this particular session that was broader and that did contemplate some of these issues. But it's been more positional and positioning ourselves as a resource.
And so a lot of what you talked about is what you have started to do and where those are going, what your next steps are. And so I'm wondering if there's other folks that have next steps that you're planned that we would want to share about and talk about how you all are continuing this work.
Well, so I'm interested actually in hearing from people that have been listening at this leadership conference about a few things. So for Outfront, I want us to be much more upfront about our values around racial equity and intersectionality, and also just more upfront about how we want to show up as good partners, good coalition partners, good comrades in our struggle for equity and justice in Minnesota. And so I'm just actually actively I want to see other organizations' statements about that. And then I think for us, I think we just want to continue to be more, continue to be more intentional and more planful around how we're showing up around racial equity. And I think there's so many good opportunities right now for hard conversations and good ones. And then also I feel like probably pretty easy. There's just so much Islamophobia, so much xenophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-LGBTQ, anti-Black racism, that there's a lot of opportunities, I think, for us as an organization to be speaking out and showing up with our partner organizations however they want us to show up. And so that's something that I think we just have to continue to keep working on. And then I also really want us to keep engaging around what we're doing with the criminal justice system. And I feel like for Outfront, we have had some inroads in working on some reform, but I actually think there's a good opportunity just in our communities to talk about police, particularly around Pride. I think is always the good one. Every year we think about how we want to do more around talking about police and Pride, and then for us, we've had some good conversations, and then also not great conversations with the people who organize our Pride, and we mostly don't ever really win out at any of the things we ask for. But I think that as a movement, I think that that's just really a good place where I think people get to really see the disparate, the two different worlds that white people and people of color have with interactions with police. And I think it brings out a lot for us to hopefully grow and learn as white people. So that's anyway a conversation. If you're having good conversations about that and good movement, I'd also love to hear from all of you about that.
Monica, can I follow up with you and ask if you can talk a little bit more about the police at Pride and kind of how what has been true for you all in your state and what you all have been doing around that as an organization?
Sure. So we have an anti-violence program, and so we work a lot with our Pride, the volunteers for our Twin Cities Pride, which is pretty big. It's like one of the bigger ones in the country. And we offer to do de-escalation training, and we offer to actually be involved so that we can hopefully have less police presence in the park, that we're actually having our volunteers and our staff. We don't have that many staff in the park. We do have 4 right now. And we have volunteers. And so we try to train the volunteers. We have a lot of faith leaders who sign up and work with us, so who already have good skills around de-escalation. And that's our hope and dreams are always that we could talk our Pride into having less police in the park. And then of course in the parade route, not having police in uniforms. They used to give free space to the police in our pride, which we figured out through some of our meetings with them. And so that doesn't happen anymore. But for us, it's been part of the problems we've had is that because we've been the organization who's been pushing one of them, now there's others too, that then we have been taken out of the whole process. But a couple of things that we did while we still had a little bit of involvement was we met with the police chief and met with our park police and did some trainings, and also talked about how we don't think it's not a safe space if there's police in the park. So that's when we got cut out of the process. And I'll say that I think the other way that I think about it is we have protests in our pride. This year we didn't really have one, which is odd. But most years, and there's been out front staff and out front people involved in out front who have been a part of the protest while the Dixon bikes go by, and then there's the protest and different direct action. And we also got in trouble because we had staff and supporters who took their t-shirts off as part of the protest and then jumped in line with our parade unit. And then we had signs that mirrored what they were saying. So the whole thing I'm saying is I'm also really interested in thinking about how do we use those opportunities. What those activists and those protesters always face is hearing so much racism and terribleness. So we've been trying to think about, well, what if we had more resources or even just like more thought behind it. Could we have organizers along the parade route who hold up support signs, hold up something, or like bow down and like show their solidarity. So anyway, that's my thoughts for next year. But we haven't tried that one yet, but I think it'd be great.
So again, I hear you thinking about how and acting as an organization to leverage that position, and so trying to connect and support to the activists that are really trying to push against police presence, and in the formal meetings, really bring up how police make it an unsafe place for people of color and for a lot of white LGBTQ people as well, and then how that the response to this latest thing was that you're excluded from the formal process, which can happen, and so then figuring out what that next step is for you all to informally still use your position as an organization, but to continue to support the activists to continue to push for reducing police presence. So we have a lot of folks who are listening to you all right now that are not executive directors, and so I'm wondering about what you think other folks who are in member organizations or who are in partner organizations might need to hear about how we can collectively move our racial justice focus forward in our LGBTQ movement. So, Adrian, you have the mic, so you
So if you got to hang out with me at all this week, I've been saying that I have a new windmill that I'm tilting against, and I think we all have a role in interrupting and stopping performative, non-reciprocal intersectionality. In that, the wider movement, the progressive movement has, taken this shift. It's sexy to talk about race and equity, and it's been corporatized. And we all have a role in interrupting that and making sure that that does not happen in a way that actually dilutes the conversation and tokenizes the conversation. And so for folks who are wanting to help their organizations or move their organizations to a racial equity frame, yes, please do that. Do it internally, and we also need to think about how all of our organizations interact with each other in a way that doesn't dilute the conversation. It's also an emerging. This is something I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm beginning to find those words of, the harm that many of this wider move that folks have made is making up the work that we actually should do. And so queer trans organizations like ours are positioned to have this conversation and to make sure that folks are thinking and talking about this in a way that doesn't perpetuate that harm.
And why, so you just said that we are uniquely positioned as queer and trans organizations. What do you think makes us unique in that position?
Because I know we cannot and should not and never should have separated the ideas, our identities are not separate and intersect and with race. And so we are positioned to have that conversation because, because they intersect and that's why.
Sorry, sometimes the follow-up questions, but then it's challenging to have the complexity, because it's such a complex situation that we're in, and we're such complex beings, and how is it that we can acknowledge and honor that complexity as we move forward? I want to get to know if you had anything that you would want folks to know, whether they be EDs or member organizations, other staff members, or in partner organizations as well, as we move forward as a movement. What might be helpful for folks to know about how racial justice can be part of our movement?
I think we have to just keep focusing on how we're actually doing it in our organizations, how we're acting, and taking some bold risks and making mistakes and being okay with that. But I think, I think it's the way that we can have progress. It's the way that we can actually make real changes in people's lives. And so that looks like, for organizations, there's all of the internal super structural geeky stuff, but there's, all of our committees, how about all of our work plans, actually asking that. I love that for Outfront we started asking candidates, I think, before we actually asked that of ourselves, like, how are you advancing racial equity, and then we weren't really doing as much inside. But I think we still have a lot more work to do on that too. But I feel like, as coalition partners in Minnesota, it's who you decide to be in coalition with. It's who you decide who to share any resources you have, or for Outfront, we're luckily one of the bigger organizations, so we have space, and so we try to share space, and we try to share our copier. We try to be fiscal sponsors for anyone who wants to, who is actually doing that work. But I think there's probably a million different ideas, but I think to keep it in the front of our minds and in our hearts, and keep being bold.
A question that's open to you, answer.
So I would just say there's a couple ways that I think folks can take action. One of them, and I'm just going to applaud one of my staff members, and that's Ames, is to show up. Ames, even before we had a ED that made this a priority, Ames showed up at coalition meetings, showed up at the table at things, and was a partner, even, and probably repeatedly took a couple slaps in the face because people did not trust the organization, but that didn't stop them from doing that. So I think that's something that everyone can do, is to be present and support organizations, coalition partners that may not even want us, that are Black and brown and trans-led and women-led organizations, to be a good partner. Another thing that we have made a priority, and it's a starting point, is to support smaller prides that are Black and brown and trans-led for those communities, even if you cannot table, even if you cannot be present. I think those are important. And I think another big step is also, as you begin your journey, to figure out how you're not the person at the table talking about these issues. And so it's important to create pathways for Black and brown and trans and gender nonconforming and women to be talking about their lives, because all of us who do this work, we're sitting here, have some level of privilege that other people don't have, and they need to be able to tell their stories. And they don't need, us giving cliff notes or examples. They need to be equipped with training and curriculum and all of those different things, whatever it is that they feel that they need to be prepared to do the trainings about their lives and their realities. That has to happen. So those are some ways I think that are a starting point until you can deconstruct some of the things inside of yourself. And then lastly, I would just say, just something we always say at another organization that I work with is just be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. And that means looking inside yourself. I have to constantly look at myself to see if I'm transphobic, to see if I'm sexist, to see if I have internalized racism, and to continue to deconstruct those things so that when I walk out into spaces, I'm being the best possible ally that I can be.
Something that popped up for me listening to you all is about how there's a tenacity in the face of the challenges that you have encountered and anticipate encountering as you are centering a racial justice lens, which means, as you have all mentioned, dismantling white supremacy. And that is a lot of work and really challenging. And so a question that pops up for me that we haven't talked about before is how you all are sustaining yourselves. What is it that you're doing to, what supports do you have? Like, how do you keep going?
So I vent a lot with good friends. I try and eat really healthily most of the time, and take a lot of care around exercise and having downtime. I actually don't hold on to things. And so when conflict comes up, generally I try and address it in the moment, so I'm not walking around carrying these things. That doesn't mean that I don't leave conversations with frustration, but I also know that as much as I can externalize it, so I'm not carrying it around, that's helpful. And so I try and talk through things with people that I have conflict around or that I need to move on issues. And then, frankly, sometimes you're just exhausted by it all, but you have to keep in mind just self-care. And fortunately, I have a really great group of friends that are political family that hold me in that space and help me. When I was dealing with challenges, I realized that I was just soldiering through things, and my friends were like, "What are you doing for self-care?" So I was like, I better do something. So I think having a good group of friends who can hold some of these issues that come up with you is also crucial.
So I think that one thing that I found is I feel like yesterday in the caucus for white people, we were talking about how a part of white supremacy culture is you really probably hold on to individualism quite a bit. And like, I'm gonna figure the problem out, study a bunch, so I have to always check myself on that, and then to actually, I think the best thing is to be in community with people and actually talk about it and be vulnerable, and that feels and have other people do the same. And I feel like that is the most life-giving joy that I get, is you have tough conversations, the tough issues we all deal with, but that you get to do it with other people. It's like.
You don't have to answer if you don't want to.
I mean, I don't have a good answer. I mean, it's the, yeah. There's more of a, there's no, and I think it's much the same, like, you know, putting yourself in those situations where you have to have the conversations and being vulnerable, I think is part of the, you know, the actual self-care and yeah, so.
Well, what I hear from all three of you is that it is the word that you used, Monica, was life-giving, that by engaging in dismantling white supremacy, you are gaining life, and that you are recognizing that in community, and while you are in community and getting that reflection and getting that support and doing the hard work, that it's the hard work that is feeding you in the process, is part of what I'm hearing. So think about this conversation that we've had and the work that you all have done as organizations and as individuals to center racial justice in the LGBTQ advocacy work that you're doing organizationally. I'm wondering if there's anything else that has popped up for you that you would like to share with us all right now about that. Sometimes anything else, you know, leads to things, and sometimes it doesn't. So I just want to so much thank you all so much for the sharing the wisdom and knowledge and lessons learned that you shared today, because the package of presentation that you're able to do here about why you're doing it and how you've been doing it as an organization and what your next steps are, I'm sure did not take this short amount of time to present, but took a lot of hard work to get to a place where you can even talk about it and sharing it with everyone here. So if we can give a big round of applause. And we do have actually a few minutes for questions. Mel, would you be willing to run a mic? So we've got a mic up here. So do we have any questions that folks have? So Ronald's got a question back there.
Thank you very much. What you guys realize now, I view you guys as leaders in this field, and so in this area. And what I was hope is that those of us who are not far along, maybe you could throw us a lifeline. You know, because in Equality Michigan, I'm on the board of Equality Michigan for the Federation, this does not come up. We have a mini retreat, and the agenda is focused on our fundraising fall, because we've been focusing on meeting payroll. So to even bring this up is just, so if they can see that other states are working on this, that would help me get in. Because if I bring it up, the eyes kind of roll, yeah, there's some black guy talking about racial stuff. So, you know, think of us who are not even where you are. So whatever you can do to help us, we appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, in any way that you need support, let's just talk. We can talk about it. I think we're all on different levels of journey around here, and so I think it sounds like you need a starting point, and perhaps you introduce the conversation, since you're talking about fundraising and development, is like, how are we connecting to communities that we're not already connected to bring them into the organization, and what is that? What do we need to do to be an organization that welcomes those folks? There are different ways that you can talk about racial equity. Sometimes you have to fool people into getting engaged in it, and that's one way. Like, ooh, let's look around and who's not sitting at this table. What do we need to do to be an organization that makes everyone feel welcome? And that's an easier conversation than saying we need a racial equity lens, you know?
Ron, I wish I had something more utilitarian to say, but I think we need to have a wider conversation about how the money behind everything that we do is enabling and participating in white supremacy. And the work that we have to do is participating in that system. Maybe even just saying that is, like we have to raise money, and capitalism is white supremacy.
Yeah. So it's a little obvious to me, but also I also think looking at the opportunities that are lost and really actually having them wrestle with that. And I took all the notes on what you're doing with your board, Kendra, and having people, I think, look at not only who's like not at the table and who you're not in coalition with, but also look at all the opportunities that are lost that we're actually not able to raise the money we need because we're not being vocal about really working for all LGBTQ people. And I believe that, it's been we've lost donors for a lot of things I talked about today, but we've also gained new supporters and new donors. And we're much more clear about, I think, our values, and I feel like people come to us then more.
Another question? Oh, there is one more, great.
In what ways are you addressing Indigenous communities, particularly Two-Spirit and folks beyond the binary in their Indigenous genders?
In not enough ways. From New Mexico, in New Mexico there are 23 sovereign nations, pueblos and tribes in the state, and part of the work that we are doing is to support organizations that so Today Equality is working on making sure that marriage equality comes to the Navajo Nation. They also very specifically and intentionally are not becoming a 501c3 tax status organization because that is participating in this system that we're talking about, right? And so we do a lot of work to help support them in doing their work, and I wish we did more, and I'm glad you brought that up.
So honestly, I'm still learning about the communities that are in North Carolina, so it's not an area, it's not a group of people that I personally have reached out to. I don't know with Ames if you've had any engagement with any of the different folks in North Carolina, but I appreciate the question because it should be an area of our focus.
Yeah, I think we for Upfront, we have a lot more to do. And I would say that, I think that's the biggest urban First Nation community in the country. And it's also, of course, where there's, I think, the most poverty, lack of any kind of resources. And it's really wild. It's a really small area. And so people, I think maybe it's gotten a lot of national news, but people have started living in tents. They were living in tents this past winter in Minnesota, where there were just inches and inches of snow every day, and it just shows, I think, the systemic poverty and the discrimination that Indigenous, First Nation, and Native people face in our state.
So, being a border state, we are intimately involved with this. Intimately is probably not the right word, but we are involved in this conversation about migration and the crisis that's being manufactured at our border. and we are actively participating in that work. New Mexico has the only trans pod, and that it's a corporately run private prison that houses trans asylum seekers that are coming to the United States seeking refuge. So we're a part of that conversation, but a part of, I wish we did act, we actually did more, but a part of where we are all positioned, I think, to contribute to that conversation is, in those small ways that we communicate our message. That you may or may not have heard about this, but they're the governors of Colorado and New Mexico started this little Twitter fight about who has the best green chili. And I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying this, but for the first time in a couple of months, the governor's office contacted me and asked me to weigh in on this little thing, this little tiff that was happening between Jared Polis and Michelle Obama, our governor, about who has the best green chili. And it's like, we have no chill. And so I was just like, but our response was, this conversation is fun and all. Yeah, this tourism thing is fun and all, but these borders crossed the people before this conversation of chili in Colorado or New Mexico happened. And so we constantly look for these opportunities to point out the racism and discrimination in these weird little fun fights that we get to have about what food we eat, right? And so I think that's part of this conversation and where we're positioned to be effective is to communicate no, these borders cross us, and you're helping us, you're making us participate in the system.
So let's give another round of applause for our folks.